Elements of this story are going to seem familiar. A new player observes that there seems to be some money in this new thing called comic books. They look around, they see the big players are all reprinting comic strips licensed from newspaper syndicates. The difference is, this time it's the newspaper syndicate doing the looking around. United Features, which had been around since 1919 but only had bankable stars since 1930, saw that Eastern Color, Dell, and David McKay were gobbling up all the popular comic strip characters, and they said, "Hey, what about us?" Then they got tired of waiting and decided to eliminate the middleman, becoming the first syndicate to republish their own strips in comic book form. And so Tip Top Comics was born. The first issues cover boasts over 100 funnies, and it doesn't mean over 100 funny jokes. At the time, it would have been understood that comic strips and funnies were interchangeable terms. It's an interesting claim, though, to make in a 64-page comic book. Is there more than one comic strip funny per page? Yes, because of the presence of toppers. We haven't talked about toppers at all yet, so let's spend a little time on that. The comic strips being reprinted in these early comic books are not the daily strips, but the Sunday strips, the ones that were printed in full color and the size of a full page, way bigger than the third of a page that I grew up with, and nowadays cartoonists only wish that they had that much space. But it was never actually the whole page. There was always this space left at the top for newspapers who chose to put their own banner in that space, or maybe place an ad there. For those papers that needed something to fill that space with, the syndicate would offer an extra narrow strip that filled just that much space, and it was called a topper. It might be, but was not always, created by the same artist who did the main strip on that page, as like a backup income. But the topper was always paired with that main strip and were meant to be published together. So what did United Features bring to the table? Oh, not much. Just Hal Foster's Tarzan. Harold, or just Hal, Rudolph Foster, was born in 1892 Nova Scotia. While other artists I profiled took correspondence courses or went to college to learn art, Foster dropped out of school at the age of 13, and he self-taught himself art by studying the art books at his local library and practiced, practiced, practiced. He drew art for store catalogs, which at that time didn't use photographs yet, but he could find no other work in the art field and wound up being a wilderness guide and dabbled in gold prospecting. He might have stayed in the wilderness, but at the age of 23 he married and needed the money to start a family, and, well, Canada never did have its own gold rush. So he moved to Chicago like Roy Crane and E.C. Segar did before or after him, and there he took up more serious study. And even then, all I got was some advertising work for a while. Tarzan was already the most famous of Edgar Rice Burroughs' many creations. Tarzan had already been around since 1912 and by 1927 had appeared in 11 novels, a silent film, and a Broadway play. Edgar knew how to promote his creations, and he had an advertising agency looking into ways to get Tarzan in other media. At first, the illustrator of the Tarzan books was approached about creating a Tarzan comic strip, but he didn't want to do it. And so it fell into Hal Foster's hands because people in ad agencies just happen to know each other. Tarzan is where Foster experimented with an impressionist art style, but landed on a high level of draftsmanship and detail. Much of that you would see not in Tarzan, but in Foster's next strip, the one he created himself, Prince Valiant. If you read comic books, odds are you like some comic book artists who would name Hal Foster's long run on Prince Valiant as one of their biggest influences, and they will repay him by swiping his panel art for decades to come. In Tip Top Comics, Tarzan got up to 6 pages of real estate, which was a larger portion of each issue than any strip was getting in any other comic book at this time, which, following the famous Funnies model, capped out at 4 pages. But as much as future comic book artists were loving Hal Foster's Tarzan, and as popular as Tarzan was as a character, that wasn't the most popular comic strip in Tip Top, and that would be L'il Abner. Alfred Gerald Kaplan better known as Al Cap, was born in 1909 Connecticut to Jewish parents who had been brought to America from Latvia as children. At the age of 9, young Al is run over by a trolley car and his mangled leg is amputated above the knee. It is while convalescing that Al's father, an amateur artist, teaches his son to draw. Al decided he wanted to be a cartoonist when he learned Bud Fisher, the creator of Mutt and Jeff, was making a staggering $3,000 a week. Dropping out of high school just before graduation, the impoverished Al came up with an innovative way of getting an art education, attending the Boston Museum School of Fine Arts, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and Designers Art School in Boston, each before being expelled for not paying tuition. In 1932, at the age of 22, he was given a job taking over his first comic strip, a single-panel gag strip called Colonel Gilfeather. Al hated it, and having no control over the strip, decided to quit after just 6 months. This was the Great Depression, so for most people, this is where the story ends, with a stubborn young man starving to death in some New York City alley. But like E.C. Cigar, Al befriended an already established cartoonist who changed his life. Ham Fisher, no relation to Bud Fisher, was the creator of Joe Palooka, the subject of episode 6. Instead of helping Al find a job, Ham gave him one as an assistant. This time, Al loved the strip he was working on, which had the space to convey story and messaging. He loved it so much that he took the core concept of Joe Palooka, a naive innocent contrasting against a more cynical world, and transplanted it into hillbilly Kentucky to create L'il Abner. L'il Abner, like Joe Palooka, is all but forgotten today, but the strip ran for 43 years, all created by Al Cap, though he did employ assistants. And at its peak, it was carried in 900 newspapers in 28 countries and was read by 60 million readers. The strip ended in 1977, but I never grew up seeing it, and my only exposure to L'il Abner was an unsuccessful attempt to license schmooze, one of the many fantasy species that inhabited L'il Abner's South, to cartoons. You can find some, but not all, issues of Tip Top Comics to read online, but the only thing limiting your access to most of the contents is just the rarity of these issues. No one out there in the world seems to have a copy of Tip Top Comics numbers 1 through 5, for example, that they have been willing to scan the contents of. Most of the rest of the contents have fallen into the public domain as much as they have fallen into obscurity. Alice Cinders, Jim Hardy, Little Mary Mix-Up, Peter Pat, Fritzy Ritz, and Bronco Bill barely even qualify as trivia answers today. The only properties still under protection and harder to read are Tarzan and L'il Abner. Edgar Rice Burroughs' estate has fastidiously protected all trademarks to his many creations, even as copyrights continue to expire on them. L'il Abner never fell into the public domain yet because the rights to it never stayed in any defunct publisher's hands. Wanting full control over a strip, Al Cap sued United Features for the rights to L'il Abner and won it back in 1948, so his estate has been protecting his trademarks ever since. I'll be protecting your rights to learn more about the history of comic books here on this channel, and I hope that you come back and spend my next episode with me. Bye for now.